Hey, everybody, welcome to episode 13 of the FAFO Academy Podcast. I'm Gemma, your host, and today we will be talking about the consequence nobody thinks about. Most people think they're good at predicting consequences. In reality, they're not. They're actually good at predicting the first consequence only. And what changes lives isn't usually the first consequence. It's what happens after that. So, one of the biggest mistakes people make in life, in business, in relationships, money, and health rarely, if ever, come from the first consequence. They come from that chain reaction that follows the first consequence, like a snowball effect. Now, the people who consistently make better decisions have one habit. They ask, and then what happens? So when people think about consequences, they usually stop at the obvious one. So, like, for example, I'll skip today's workout. So what? It's only one workout. I'll charge this one thing to my credit card. It's only a few $100. I'll just ignore this one argument. It'll blow over. Because those first consequences in and of themselves seem small and seemingly inconsequential. But that is because that's rarely where the real damage happens. The real damage begins with that first decision and what that first decision actually sets into motion. So that workout you skipped becomes a week of not working out. The credit card that you made one bad purchase on becomes years worth of debt. The ignored argument eventually becomes a form of resentment, and resentment becomes distance. And if you're talking about a marriage, resentment could lead to divorce. Now, you may say those are extreme examples, but really they're not. It's not about that one charge. It's not about that one workout you skipped. It's not about that one argument. It's what that sets the stage for. The biggest consequences in your life are not usually direct. They are indirect consequences of other choices you have made. So essentially, it's delayed. The consequences you face usually don't happen instantaneously. So that's why today we're going to talk about the consequence almost nobody thinks about. And it's simply the one that comes after the obvious one. Life happens in chains, not events. We like to think that life changes, for example, because of big moments, but it usually doesn't. It changes because one decision creates another. For example, let's go back to the missed payment thing, right? The credit card purchase. You said it's only one time, even though you know you can't afford it, leads to a missed payment. And then it can lead to a lie. It could be an ignored customer. It could be another skipped workout. But none of those things in and of themselves destroy anything. But they start a chain reaction. So people tend to focus on these isolated events instead of connected events. So, for example, let's go back to the credit card thing, because I think that that's something that mostly all of my viewers can relate to. If you have a credit card, you have debt with a bank, okay? And on your credit card statement, I believe in the United States, they're required to put, if you make the minimum payment only, then it will take you X amount of time to pay off the debt, and this is how much you'll pay. So let's say you have a balance of $5,000 and your APR is 25%, and you make the minimum payment. Let's say the minimum payment is $50. Make the minimum payment every month. It'll take you 8 years, and you'll end up paying back $11,000. Now, I didn't do the math exactly, but something like that. And then it has a number for credit counseling on there. That's the law. So people see that and people know that, but they think to themselves, well, I'll just make the minimum payment now and next month I'll pay more. Or I'll pay it off in a couple months, or I'll pay it off next month. And some people follow through with that. That's fine, but life happens. I understand that. The point is very simple. That decision to just make the minimum payment now might be okay. The problem is you're not thinking about what's next. So what about next month? Are you just going to make the minimum payment next month too? Because if you just continue making minimum payments, you're going to end up paying double what you owe over the course of many years. So if that's what you want, that's fine. But then in the meantime, the card's probably maxed out and not able to be used anyway. So what's the point? You basically just borrowed money at an extremely high rate. So what is actually going to happen as a result of that? You're either going to end up spending $2 or $3 for every dollar you actually spent. So you're going to pay $2 or $3 for every dollar you charged on the card over a period of years, or you are not going to be able to afford it anymore, and it's going to end up going on your credit report. It's going to end up as a charge-off. You could be sued. You could have your wages garnished. Those are the things that people aren't thinking about. So before you make that first purchase, put that charge on the card, you need to be thinking about, well, what happens next? And, you can't plan for every contingency in life, right? But it's funny because different generations see credit differently. So, for example, the silent generation, so, our great-grandmothers, great-grandfathers, some grandmas and grandpas now, born in the 20s and the 30s, they come from a time whereas if you didn't have the money, you didn't get it. You literally saved for it. So if you didn't have the money, you didn't charge it. You didn't incur debt for it. You just didn't get whatever the product was, whether it was a car or house, you just didn't get it. Financing, I'm not saying it didn't exist, but that wasn't a thing. That's not how they viewed it. So essentially you could say that they were thinking about what happens next. Like they don't want to be encumbered. They didn't want to be encumbered with all that debt because they understood what it meant. And then you look at generations now, it's pretty much the other way around. If you don't have the money, well, you can get it and you should get it. Now, so that's just a general mindset of different generations. So you have to ask yourself, who's really thinking about what happens next? Because clearly it's the generation now that lives in instant gratification and they don't think about what happens next. And that's part of the problem. So I'll leave you with this to wrap that section up. Most disasters in life simply begin with ordinary decisions, like making a charge on a credit card. Now, why is it that we're programmed like that? Why do our brains miss that second consequence? Because, like I just said, we are wired for immediate rewards, especially nowadays in the age of social media. So we naturally ask, what happens today? What happens right now? We don't really ask like, well, what's going to happen 6 months from now? Because we don't really have to. But we should start. For example, eating junk food, avoiding difficult conversations, buying impulsively, staying in a job you hate. That first consequence feels manageable. The second one quietly compounds. So your brain discounts future consequences while exaggerating present comfort. Now, focus a little bit on entrepreneurship and business. Business is absolutely full of second consequences, like hiring the wrong employee. So for example, first consequence, you fill the position, right? Great. But the second consequence is culture declines. Good employees leave. Customers notice. Revenue suffers. Lower prices. Let's say the first consequence could be more sales. Second consequence could be lower margins. Different customers. Could be harder growth. Ignoring customer complaints. The consequences of that could be you save time. Second consequence is your reputation could erode slowly. Now, those are very general examples. Let me tell you some real world issues that I've encountered hiring shitty employees. Now, when I hire an employee, I don't hire them because I think that they're shitty. I don't necessarily hire them because I think they'll be my best employee. I hire them because they're a good fit for me at the time and that they're a good fit for themselves. Because if, for example, they have so much else going on in their life and they have 2 or 3 other jobs, I don't believe that they're going to be able to focus enough on the job at hand. I probably would pass on them, especially because of the type of work that we do. I need somebody that can focus and really immerse themselves in the job and not make mistakes. We're in heavily regulated industries here, and mistakes can cost fines. And I have paid thousands of dollars in fines for fuck ups that my employees have made. Now, of course, I own them because they're my companies. They fucked up, and it's kind of like a vicarious liability concept. And it all comes down to the owner, and they got to foot the bill for it because the employee fucked up. Same with, like, let's say a bartender sells a drink to an underage kid, Well, they can not only be arrested and criminally charged, prosecuted, but that establishment, the restaurant or the bar or whatever it is, they can also be fined, even though they technically didn't really have anything to do with it. They're just vicariously liable simply because that employee was working under their auspices. So they are liable in some way for that. And not only fines, but also customer complaints. So you hire a shitty employee, or they turn out to be shitty, or they're fucking lazy, right? And unfortunately, that's a lot of what you get with the what is the new population they call Gen Z, the population that comes after the millennials. A lot of them, they just don't have good work ethic. And, you could say that's a stereotype, but I mean, stereotypes are based in fact, right? I mean, just look at the statistics. They really just want to be paid to do little to nothing. They don't want to work 40 hours a week anymore. I mean, that's gone to the wayside. It's very difficult, and that can affect your customer base. So, for example, you hire an employee to take care of orders, and they're supposed to be shipping out orders as they come in. And they tell you that they are. They're marking that they're shipping these orders. And then, you get a call, a text, or some other employee says, hey, John Smith with order number 39812 just called in or sent an email saying he never got his package. And then we go back and ask the employees working in the orders, like, well, how come this hasn't shipped out? Oh, well, I left it in my car. Well, what is it left in your car for? You're supposed to take it to the post office. Oh, well, my kid was sick. Oh, or there was ice on the road. Well, that's not an excuse. You either should have let somebody know so that they could have brought the package, or not marked it shipped so that we could contact the customer and try to avoid a complaint before it came in. And that's a real world example. It doesn't necessarily mean they're a completely shitty employee, but I mean, you could argue that they're just incompetent. So it can definitely affect your customer base for sure. So essentially, getting back to the decisions thing, what happens next? You have that shitty employee, for example. Businesses rarely fail because of one bad actor, They're going to fail because of those bad decisions, the culmination of the bad decisions that reinforce another. And, relationships follow the same rules. Nobody wakes up divorced. Nobody wakes up disconnected. It happens gradually over time. One conversation ignored. One broken promise. One assumption. One apology never made. Those become habits, and habits become patterns, and patterns become relationships. People become comfortable with the relationships that they have and the people that they have. So if there's a brewing resentment, something that is unresolved, issues that have been swept under the rug, so to speak, that is clearly known and felt by both parties, and both parties choose to keep it that way. Now, maybe they choose to keep it that way because it feels better that way, because it's some type of psychological and emotional avoidance. But what they're not thinking about is what is actually going to happen as a result of ignoring those problems, those issues now. Because guess what? They're not going away. You need to realize that most issues, intra-relationship issues, are like a leaky faucet. It does not improve on its own. Okay? This is not something that can just self-fix or reverse itself without some work, without some outside force, without actually putting in the effort to change something about the relationship. Those issues that have been swept under the rug will continue to fester, sometimes for years, and that could end up in, let's say it's a marriage, it could end up in a divorce, it could end up in a nasty divorce with legal proceedings, and you could stand to lose a lot, more than just financially. But nobody seems to think about that. They just say, you know what? I don't need to have that hard conversation today. Maybe it'll happen eventually. Maybe it won't. Bottom line is, people will remember the breakup, but they forget the hundreds or thousands of moments and decisions that built the foundation for that breakup. Every decision solves one problem and creates another. This is a very important part of this podcast. There is a give and take to everything in life. And there is also an inherent risk to everything that we do on a daily basis. Every choice we make has trade-offs. For example, you quit your job, you may gain freedom, but lose stability. If you stay, you may maintain stability, but lose opportunity. For example, you could raise prices of your goods or your services, and you may lose some customers, but gain healthier margins. There's no perfect decision. Sometimes there's really not even a right and a wrong decision for every given situation in every given circumstance in life. Sometimes there's just the best decision at this moment. So there's only different consequences. Let me bring up an extreme example here. Let's say you got on the cartel's shit list, and whether it's a Mexican-based cartel or somewhere in Saudi Arabia where, they're known to be savages and they'll torture you. They'll eviscerate you. They'll cut your fingers off and your your limbs off while you're still alive, take your heart out. They'll do stuff like that to prove a point and to basically scare other people. Hey, if you fucking cross us, this is what could happen to you. Now, so here's an extreme example of thinking about what happens next. For example, if I had ever found myself in one of those situations, I would absolutely try my best to just run. Why? So they'd have to shoot me, because I wouldn't want to subject myself to that. So in other words, I'd be thinking about I know what these motherfuckers are capable of. So I'm going to try everything in my power so that they don't do it. Like if I know that my time is ending right now, I'm going to do everything in my power to make it as quick and painless as possible for myself. So, even the people, they cut their heads off while they're still alive. I mean, they know it's going to happen. And I'm thinking to myself, like, they may be drugged up, but you really don't know for sure. I don't know why these people just don't run. Because they would just get shot. I'm assuming they would just shoot them. Now, they might not. They might run away from them. Or they might run after them. And they might knock them out or something. But then again, if you're knocked out, then you're knocked out. So it just kind of doesn't make sense to me that these people just kind of accept what they're going to do to them. They don't even try to make it less painful for themselves. I don't really understand that. The only thing I can think of is they're not thinking about what happens next. They're just so paralyzed with fear in the moment. But they really should be thinking about, well, if why not run? I don't know what they think. They think they're going to let them go? So it's really interesting. So getting back to the different consequences, right? In that extreme example, the consequence is the same. It's death. It's just the way that it happens, right? So, a good decision maker isn't going to ask, what do I gain? They're going to ask, what am I choosing along with it? So every solution introduces a new problem. The question is whether it's a better problem. Here's the habit that changes everything. So before an important decision, you should ask, here's a framework for you. What's the obvious consequence? What's the consequence of that consequence? If I repeat the decision for a year, where does it lead? And what future version of me inherits this choice? This is not overthinking. This framework is strategic thinking. So again, I think everybody already consciously does the first one. Well, what's the obvious consequence? But then people don't take it a step further and say, well, what's the consequence of that? You have to start doing that. And then again, repetition, you have to ask, so if I do it again, what will happen after a year? And what version of me inherits the choice? So better decisions don't usually come from being smarter. They simply come from looking one step further. Life is like a game of chess. It really is. If you don't know how to play, you should learn how to play chess. Because really, that's life. And you need to start thinking more than one move ahead. And if you do that when you're driving, you'll become a much safer driver too. So let's talk about playing a movie forward. So let's say whenever you're about to make an important decision, don't freeze the frame. Instead, play the movie. So, well, if I say this, what happens next? If I stay, what happens next? If I leave, what happens next? And if I don't change anything and I keep doing exactly what I'm doing today, then what happens next? And then ask yourself, where does the movie end? And the people with the best judgment, you have to understand, they're not psychic. They simply let the movie play longer than everyone else. That is what you need to start doing. Let the movie play out. The future usually whispers before it screams. Now let's bring all this together. Most people don't make terribly bad decisions. They just simply make ordinary, everyday decisions without considering what those decisions eventually become. Life is built through accumulation. One conversation, one purchase, one habit, one compromise, one opportunity accepted or ignored. That is an example of the culmination. So this week, every time you're about to make an important decision, ask yourself, what happens next? And that one question has the power to change the quality of every decision you make. The first consequence gets your attention. The consequence nobody thinks about is the one that shapes your life.